One daughter is a doctor. The other is a maid, my father announced, raising his crystal glass before 14 guests at our family Thanksgiving dinner. Then he laughed, and they all followed. My 8-year-old daughter, Mia, sat right next to me. She tugged my sleeve, her eyes wide and confused. "Mummy," she whispered, "is being a maid bad?" I did not cry. I did not flinch. I just stared at the deep red wine in my glass until the world went cold and clinical. That was the last Thanksgiving I stayed silent, because what I said next changed everything, especially for my father. He has not hosted a holiday dinner since. Welcome to the Turning Tables Stories channel. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world drift by, I'm reminded that clarity often follows the coldest betrayals. I'd love to know where you're watching from today and what your favorite drink is. I truly enjoy reading your comments. But to understand that night, we must go back to the beginning. I did not let the tears fall. Sadness is a currency I stopped spending on my father years ago. As the laughter of 14 people followed me out of the dining room, I felt a familiar coldness settle over my bones. It was not the kind of cold that makes you shiver. It was the kind that makes you see with perfect, lethal precision. I led my daughter, Mia, away from the smell of expensive rosemary turkey and toward the back of the property. We walked past the rows of white roses my mother, Kimberly, spends thousands of dollars to maintain, and we stepped into the shadows of the garden cottage. 6 years. I have lived in this 300-square-foot box for 6 years. My father, Stephen, calls it an act of grace. I call it a storage unit for the daughter he is ashamed of. I tucked Mia into her bed, her small face still etched with the confusion of a child who had just been told her mother was less than human. I kissed her forehead and promised her that things were about to change. I was not just talking to her. I was signing a mental contract with myself. I sat down at my small, scratched wooden table and opened my laptop. The blue light illuminated the room, highlighting the peeling wallpaper and the damp spot on the ceiling that Stephen refused to fix. I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a bookkeeper performing a final audit. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, not to wipe away moisture, but to summon the focus I needed for the balance sheet I was about to settle. My father thinks I spend my days scrubbing floors for $30 an hour. He thinks my life is a series of bleach stains and sore knees. He has never once asked for the name of my company. He has never searched for the woman he calls his maid. If he had, he would have found Coastal Heritage Management. He would have seen that the daughter he mocks in front of his friends is the same woman who manages a $4,500,000 portfolio of luxury estates. I opened my inbox and found the thread from Benjamin Vance. He is the most powerful residential developer in South Carolina and my biggest client. He does not know my maiden name. To him, I am the most reliable operator in the region. He had sent an invitation for a final strategy session on the land deal he was closing with my father. I typed a short, professional confirmation and hit send. The click of the mouse sounded like a gavel hitting a block. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, my personal attorney. It was late, but Marcus answers when I call. This was not about family affection anymore. It was a business transaction. I have been the silent investor in my father's version of family for too long. I realized that my love had been a subscription service, and I was the one footing the bill while he provided zero value. My compassion was a luxury he had overdrafted until the account was empty. "Marcus," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's, "it is time. Activate the legacy retrieval plan. I want every forged document, every truant tax record, and every penny of Mia's trust fund accounted for by Monday morning." This was not revenge. It was accounting. And by the time the sun rose over Charleston, I knew my father was going to find out exactly how much he owed me. I looked out the small, fogged window of the cottage at the main house, where the lights were still blazing. 6 years ago, I did not walk through that front door. I crawled. I returned to Charleston with a broken marriage, a 2-year-old child, and $0 in my bank account. My father, Stephen, did not offer a hug. He offered terms. He told me the garden cottage was empty and that I should not turn living there into a habit. He treated my arrival like a bad debt he was forced to consolidate. The disparity in this family has always been calculated. Stephen spent $800,000 to ensure Olivia became a doctor. He paid for the tutors, the elite prep schools, and every cent of her tuition without blinking. But when it was my turn, he sat me down and told me that community college was plenty for someone like me. He did not explain what someone like me meant, but the silence that followed said enough. I took out $35,000 in federal loans and worked 3 jobs just to graduate with honors from a school he refused to attend my commencement for. The years that followed were a blur of chemical smells and raw hands. While Olivia was at her residency, I was scrubbing the baseboards of the same people Stephen was desperate to impress. I did not resent the work. I resented the invisibility. I began to notice a gap in the market. The wealthy estate owners in Charleston did not just need cleaners. They needed managers. They needed someone to handle the complexity of their lives while they were away. I started Coastal Heritage Management at 2 a.m. on a laptop I bought from a pawn shop. The turning point was my aunt, Teresa. She was the only one who saw the woman beneath the apron. She sat me down in her antique shop and handed me a check for $30,000. It was not a loan. It was equity. She told me that someone should have believed in me a long time ago. I took that money and hired my first crew. I stopped being the woman who cleaned the houses and became the woman who owned the company that managed them. People often ask why I stayed in that crumbling cottage once the checks started getting bigger. They do not understand the invisible chains of a survivor. Staying was not a sign of weakness. It was a strategic retreat. It was a prison without bars, a psychological cage built on the fear of losing Mia's connection to her family. Beyond the emotional ties, staying was a calculated legal move. My attorneys advised that maintaining my residency on the estate was crucial for the forensic audit of the property's maintenance funds. I kept a sleek office downtown for business meetings, but I slept in that cottage to document every cent my father embezzled under the guise of upkeep. I stayed to ensure my foundation was poured in concrete before I made my move. I stayed because I knew that in a small town like this, Stephen's reputation was a weapon he would use to frame me as the ungrateful daughter. I needed to be so successful that his words would eventually bounce off me like rain on a slate roof. I looked at my bank statement one last time before closing the laptop. Coastal Heritage Management had just cleared $4,500,000 in annual revenue. My father's Maid was now his biggest financial threat. The justified anger I had suppressed for 6 years had finally evolved into something much more useful. It had become a business plan. The summons came on a Monday morning. My father, Stephen, called me into his study, a room that smelled of expensive pipe tobacco and old leather, the place where he made pronouncements, not requests. He did not ask me to sit. He simply pushed a thick, notarized document across the mahogany desk. "I need you to sign this," he said, his voice as flat as a foreclosure notice. I looked at the bold header, agreement to vacate. The deadline was March 1st. I scanned the fine print and felt my stomach drop. This was not just a move-out order, it was a waiver of all claims to the property. Buried on the second page was the sale price, $850,000. My father was selling the land I lived on, the only home my daughter, Mia, truly remembered. I turned to the last page and saw the buyer's name, Callaway Development Group, Benjamin Vance's firm. My father was selling my home to my biggest client. "You told Benjamin the cottage was empty," I said. It was not a question. Stephen leaned back, his chest puffed with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. "It will be empty, because I am making a business decision," he replied. He had erased the existence of his own daughter and granddaughter from a contract just to secure a better deal. The next morning, my mother, Kimberly, invited me for tea. The kitchen smelled like chamomile, and she had set out the porcelain cups with the gold rims, a peace offering wrapped in hollow tradition. "Your father is under a lot of stress," she began, her eyes damp with a rehearsed performance of concern. "He needs to sell that land, Destiny. Why can't you just be sensible?" I set my cup down, the clink of bone china sounding like a crack in a foundation. "You are asking me to make my child homeless so Dad can fix a bad investment," I said. Kimberly's expression shifted, the soft facade thinning into something sharp. "Olivia would never make things this difficult," she snapped. "Because Olivia made something of herself. In that moment, I saw the trap of their normalized cruelty with perfect clarity. To my parents, I was not a daughter. I was a scapegoat. Psychologically, they had spent years using me as a trash can for their inadequacies. By constantly labeling me the failure, the maid, the disappointment, they could maintain the illusion that Olivia was perfect and their family was a success. This was not a family dynamic. It was a branding strategy. They did not hate me. They simply needed me to stay small so the golden child could look taller. I did not argue. I did not sign the papers. I just walked out and closed the door behind me, which somehow felt louder than any scream. Stephen thought he was being practical by cutting me out. He thought his reputation in Charleston was an ironclad shield that would protect him when he threw us to the curb. But he had made a fatal error. He was selling to a man who valued integrity above all else, and he was about to find out that his most reliable operator was the very person he had just tried to evict. I walked into Marcus's office on Tuesday morning. The air did not smell like chamomile tea or rehearsed apologies. It smelled like toner, old paper, and impending litigation. I sat across from him and watched as he laid out a series of folders on the glass table. My father, Stephen, thinks he is a master of appearances. He thinks he can curate a family legacy like he curates his garden. But he forgot that I am a logistics coordinator. I do not look at the roses. I look at the irrigation system to see where the water is leaking. Marcus slid a stack of tax returns toward me. "Look at the signature," he said. I leaned in. It was my name, my handwriting. Perfect, elegant, and completely fraudulent. I recognized the stroke of the pen, the heavy, ink-rich line of the Mont Blanc fountain pen Stephen had gifted me on my 18th birthday. Back then, I thought it was a symbol of his pride in my future. Now, I realized it was just the tool he chose for his forgery. He had used a corrupt family accountant to bypass the usual IRS verification. And for years, he'd slide emergency estate papers into my hand while I was distracted with Mia, telling me they were just residency permits for the cottage. I trusted the father, so the auditor in me never thought to look at the fine print of his betrayal. For the last 5 years, Stephen had been filing documents claiming I was a full-time, live-in domestic worker for the estate. He had officially classified me as an unpaid housekeeper to claim massive tax credits and justify the upkeep of a property he could no longer afford. He was not being a generous father by letting me live in the cottage. He was using my presence as a legal shield to hide his financial decay. He had transformed my life into a tax write-off while calling me a maid to my face. But the forgery was only the beginning of the rot. Marcus opened the second folder, the one containing the records for the trust fund my grandfather had left for my daughter Mia. It was supposed to be $750,000, locked away for her education and her future. Stephen was the trustee. Marcus pointed to a ledger of withdrawals. Over the last 3 years, $200,000 had been siphoned out for management fees and property maintenance. None of that money went to the cottage. It did not go to Mia. It went to Olivia. My sister, the Golden Doctor, was a hollow statue. Marcus had found the records of her private debt. Olivia was not just carrying the $350,000 in student loans our parents like to brag about. She had an additional $350,000 in high-interest debt from a luxury lifestyle and a failed medical spa venture that Stephen had tried to keep quiet. My father was using the money meant for my daughter's future and the forced labor he claimed I provided to keep Olivia's head above water. He was cannibalizing one daughter to keep the other one on a pedestal. This was not a family dynamic. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as a Southern tradition. I looked at the documents and did not feel a single pang of sadness. I did not feel the need to. Stephen had spent 20 years telling me I was a burden. He had spent 6 years telling me I was a maid. But he was about to find out that when you steal from the person who manages your biggest client's assets, you do not just lose a daughter, you lose everything. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I told Marcus to finalize the filings. I wanted the forensic audit of the trust fund ready by Thursday. I wanted the evidence of the forgery prepared for a criminal referral. My father was hosting a Thanksgiving dinner to impress Benjamin Vance and save his $850,000 land deal. He wanted a performance. I was going to give him a premiere he would never forget. The table was set with the same blue-bordered china my mother, Kimberly, only uses for people she is desperate to impress. 14 guests sat around us, the air thick with the smell of rosemary-scented turkey and the heavy, suffocating weight of my father's expectations. Stephen stood at the head of the table, tapping his crystal glass with a silver fork. I saw the way he looked at Benjamin Vance like a man begging for a life raft. Then, he looked at me. One daughter is a doctor, a true credit to our name, while the other, bless her heart, is our dedicated domestic support. Destiny has such a specialized talent for the background work, keeping our floors shining while the rest of us focus on the family's legacy. It's a humble role, but I suppose every empire needs its help. He laughed. A few guests joined in that nervous, reflexive sound people make when they do not want to be the next target. My sister, Olivia, looked at her plate, her expensive diamond ring catching the flickering candlelight. Under the table, Mia's hand found mine. It was cold. I did not squeeze it back out of comfort. I squeezed it out of ironclad certainty. This was the moment the subscription to his version of family finally expired. I stood up, slowly. The sound of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor was loud, final, and perfectly timed. Every head turned. Stephen's smile did not just fade, it disintegrated. Destiny, he said, his tone shifting back to the sharp command of a master to a servant. Sit down. This is not the time. You made it the time, Dad, I replied. My voice was level, unhurried, and entirely clinical. I was not an ungrateful daughter in that moment. I was an auditor, closing a 6-year investigation. You have stood at this table and defined me for 20 years. Now, I am going to define the balance sheet. I looked at the guests, then back at my father. I started by cleaning houses, I said, and I am not ashamed of a single hour of that labor. But I did not stop there. I did not just scrub floors. I analyzed the operations of the elite. I built Coastal Heritage Management. Last year, our annual revenue hit $4,500,000. I have 12 full-time employees, and I manage 15 of the most prestigious luxury estates in the Shenandoah Valley. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has a physical weight, like the air had been vacuumed out of the room. My mother's hand went to her throat. Olivia's eyes went wide as she recalculated the value of the sister she had spent years ignoring. Stephen's face turned the color of ash. Then, from 3 chairs down, Benjamin Vance stood up. He did not look at my father. He looked only at me. And then he bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. Destiny, he said, using my name with a weight that made the room shiver. You are the most reliable operator I have ever worked with. Benjamin turned to my father. Stephen was shaking now, his hand still white-knuckling his glass. Stephen Benjamin said, his voice as cold as a legal deposition. You told me last week that the garden cottage on this property was vacant. You told me the land was ready for immediate development. Stephen stammered, but Benjamin cut him off with a single, sharp look. You lied to me, he said. You are selling me land that serves as the only home for your daughter and your granddaughter, and you are doing it while publicly insulting the very woman who manages 40% of my residential portfolio. Then Benjamin delivered the kill shot. I am cancelling the $850,000 land deal, he said. Our agreement has a strict material misrepresentation clause, Stephen. By lying to me about the vacancy of the cottage and the nature of your operational staff, you've breached the contract before the ink even dried. My legal team will be filing a formal notice of termination for cause first thing tomorrow morning. I do not do business with men who are so insecure that they have to cannibalize their own family to maintain a facade of success. Stephen collapsed into his chair, but I was not finished. Benjamin looked back at me and smiled. And for the record, Stephen, I already knew exactly who she was. I didn't reach my position by ignoring the backgrounds of my partners. I've known for 2 years that the woman you call your maid is the visionary who saved my residential portfolio. I was simply waiting for her to decide when the mask should come off. Because in this town, integrity is the only currency that actually matters. I was the silent investor who bought 30% of her company 2 years ago through a private fund because I know a winner when I see one. The maid was no longer my father's punchline. I was the woman who held the key to his financial survival. And as Benjamin and his wife walked out the front door without looking back, leaving 14 guests to stare at the wreckage of Stephen's reputation, I realized that this was not revenge. It was accounting. Calm, factual, and lethal. The silence that followed Benjamin Vance's departure was louder than the laughter had ever been. 14 households went home that night and told the story to 40 more. In a town like Charleston, news travels through pews and coffee hours faster than any internet connection. By Sunday morning, my father, Stephen, was not the respected patriarch of the street anymore. He was a cautionary tale. The $850,000 land deal did not just pause, it evaporated. Without that money, the foundation of his lies could not hold. The forensic audit Marcus conducted was devastating. Stephen was forced to repay every cent of the $200,000 he had siphoned from Mia's trust fund, along with years of accrued interest. To avoid criminal prosecution for forgery and tax fraud, he had to liquidate his retirement accounts and sell his vintage cars. My mother, Kimberly, found herself isolated from the social auxiliary group she once chaired. They did not want a leader who uplifted only the golden daughter while exploiting the maid. Olivia's fall was equally clinical. Without Stephen's constant siphoning of my daughter's future to pay her bills, her medical spa venture collapsed. She was left facing her $350,000 debt alone. She moved into a small one-bedroom rental and started working shifts at a clinic, finally learning the weight of a dollar she did not steal. My father has not hosted a holiday dinner since that night. The big house on the hill, once a stage for his performances of fatherhood, was put up for auction 6 months later. I bought it. I did not buy it to live in the master bedroom or to reclaim a childhood that never existed. I bought it through Coastal Heritage Management and turned it into the headquarters for the Eleanor Foundation. We renamed the rooms after women who built empires from nothing. The study where my father once made his cold pronouncements is now a training center for single mothers learning to navigate business law and logistics. This is what I call the justice of the sower. My father spent decades focused on the justice of punishment, on keeping me small so he could feel large. But I chose to focus on the justice of building. I did not destroy his legacy. I simply stopped being the one who held it up while he kicked me. When the fake foundation crumbled, I was already standing on the one I had built for myself. I've come to realize that you cannot earn love from people who are only willing to give it conditionally. You cannot audit a closed heart. If you find yourself sitting at a table where you are the punchline, remember that their labels only stick if you stay still long enough to let the glue dry. I spent years making myself smaller to fit into their shadow, thinking that was what a good daughter did. I was wrong. Setting a boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is the first honest thing you can do in a relationship built on silence. To those of you who have ever felt like the black sheep or the maid of your family, your worth is not a business transaction to be negotiated by people who do not see your value. You do not need a title, a toast, or anyone's permission to be proud of the work you do. Sometimes the best revenge is not a loud confrontation. It is becoming so luminous that their darkness can no longer reach you. I am sitting on the porch of my new home on Maple Street now. Mia is inside doing her homework on a desk we picked out together at Aunt Teresa's shop. The sun is setting over Charleston, and for the first time in my life, the air feels clean. I am no longer a daughter waiting for a toast. I am a woman who has built her own table. If this story meant something to you, hit like and share it for the next person who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about standing up when staying quiet would have been easier. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.